Without further ado, we'll hand it over to Dr. Mowrer.
Is it my turn already? Can you hear?
Already on the
You can
spot.
hear me okay then. All right, very good. All right, so I should just jump in. All right, so my name is Jake Mowrer. Last name rhymes with flower. That should make it easy for everyone. It usually does. Um, I have a PhD in soil chemistry and fertility, a master's in the same, and an undergrad in environmental health science. So I've been a scientist with the University of Georgia, now the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension since 2000, working mostly pretty much in soil and water chemistry. And so I identify as a chemist. That's where I have the most fun in my research program. Um, Early on, I was tasked with working primarily with the big agricultural products of Texas. Um, and that would be like wheat, cotton, forages for beef cattle and goats and sheep, mostly cattle, cotton and corn, right? And those are pretty big things, a pretty big industrial agriculture. And I noticed that the way we do things here in Texas is pretty degrading to the soil. So I started working on these things these practices that help the soil improve its function, right? Farmers were noticing that after 3 generations, that the soil was not performing as well as it was. We've had a lot of breeding, which requires a lot of fertilizer to realize the benefits of the breeding programs in terms of pest resistance, drought resistance, heat resistance, yield, all of those things. And what I started noticing very early on is that a lot of our crop plants don't produce very many roots compared to what I thought a plant should be doing based on my experience growing up on a farm in Georgia. And so I wondered if we were breeding away from root activity in order to get more photosynthesis placed up in the top of the plant for our grain or lint, cotton, those kind of things. And I came to the idea after a few years that if you're breeding towards something, if you have a plan, you're trying to get some end uh, goal out of your breeding program, chances are you're also breeding away from something. And so if we're finding plants that are investing a lot of their photosynthate into the product that we like, we expect out of it, we are probably costing them somewhere because there's always a cost, right? Nature demands balance. And so um, early on, also, I inherited a annual workshop, which is coming up in October, called Surface Mine Reclamation Workshop. And it was all about the work that these amazing scientists do, reclaiming the landscape, restoring the soil on closed down lignite or coal mines in Texas. There's a lot of coal mining in Texas, though it's gone down sharply over the last 10 years. The work in restoring those mines and making that soil function well again continues on for another 20, 30 years in a lot of cases. And I started thinking about the ways that people were approaching this. And a lot of people were using native species. Now, some people were using pastures or pine trees, but a lot of people were going to native species to restore the soil. And this was a very effective way to do it. And a little bit later, I started wading into research areas with companies that had drastically disturbed the land, like Chevron, um, Energy Coal, those kind of folks, and working with them on research projects to use natives. What are the benefits of natives? Which native species should we be focused on in planting? When should we plant them? Should we add a little bit of phosphorus? Should we not? Should we add some compost, some other organic matter? How are they reestablishing on the land? Those kind of things. And I became very, very interested to the point that I joined NIPSOT, I think in 2021. We went to Alpine, and my wife and I went to Nacogdoches and New Braunfels. And so we've been to a lot of these meetings, and there's a local chapter here that's quite active. And so that's how I threw my hat in the ring to get involved in some of these talks. So I'm a real believer in this, and I've thought very carefully about um, where we're going to effectively use natives, where we should stop using bred plants or developed genetics, um, how we're going to tackle the competition from invasives and other things that we don't want that are non-native, and how that functions to make soil do its thing better. And so we're going to talk today about native plants and their benefits to soil ecosystem function. And I need to explain that soil is its own ecosystem, and it provides ecosystem functions that are very, very important to us. And we'll go over that in a few slides here. But first of all, I want to get into this in a way that I've been thinking about quite a bit for the last few years. I was asked to develop an agroecosystem course for the University of Maine Presque Isle a couple of years ago, and I went there and trotted it out for them. And we start with the difference between a natural ecosystem, and this is a picture from the book, and I just want to point out you can see like a path or a road down here in a boat, so it's not very natural. Does anyone have any idea what the exact number of pristine ecosystems on the planet? How many are left? Does anybody know what that number is? I'll give you a hint. It's really round. Okay, it's zero. Good answer. Um, so we were comparing a natural ecosystem with an agroecosystem. And the concept here is an agroecosystem typically is monoculture. It's intensively managed, right? And we've got a lot of inputs and all those kind of things. In a natural ecosystem, we manage it almost not at all, and we don't have any expectation of it other than maybe aesthetic qualities or the things that it provides. People hunt, people go watch birds, they hike. They don't want to do that here, right? And so there's some very obvious differences between a natural ecosystem and an agroecosystem. And the point of this course was to teach the up and coming farmers who were going to get their undergrads at University of Maine Presque Isle. Beautiful place, by the way. I don't know if I want to live there in the winter, but they grow a lot of potatoes and aroostook. Anyway, we were talking about the concept of bringing an agroecosystem, which is very simple, very monolithic, closer to a natural ecosystem. And what are the early steps you would do? Well, you don't have to have monoculture, right? You can have more than one plant growing. You can have some kind of cover crops in between the rows that won't interfere or compete with your thing. You can have smaller things. You can have cotton here, cotton here, sorghum here, so that within small spaces it's monoculture, but overall across the field it's something different. You can plant border rows or borders in between that attract pollinator insects or attract different kinds of insects that will predate on the pests for your crop. There are a lot of ways you can just start getting into getting away from monoculture, right? And start having more biodiversity in your system. And as long as you're managing something, and I'm going to say this again, because if you're planting natives, you are managing, right? So it's not a natural ecosystem, but it is closer to a natural ecosystem for the soil and for the above ground life than this kind of system is, right? And so if we're thinking about things that way, there's a natural, pristine system, the ideal, untouched thing, which there are zero left on the planet, and the agroecosystem, which is just, it on the surface, it looks very contained, very ordered, very monolithic, but in reality, it's very degrading because nature is not monolithic. Nature is messy and complicated, and there's all kinds of equilibria that aren't being satisfied because things are playing with it, things are playing from this side, and it's always in flux. It's never in a state of perfect equilibrium, right? But an agroecosystem, we try and force dominion on top of it. So I want to think about these extremes and where you want to fit in between and why you're going to make those decisions yourself. Managing for native plants in your part of Texas is going to bring you closer to a natural ecosystem, and how you're going to do that. So let's go through a couple of slides here of just compare and contrast. So in a natural ecosystem, we have high biodiversity in plant species. We have trees, shrubs, understory. So many different species, right? And many are represented. There's a high density of extra species. There are vertebrates, include mice, deer, reptiles. There are predators, insects, there's prey, there's bacteria, there's fungi. In an agroecosystem, we have very low biodiversity. There's a plant species, usually one. Vertebrates, they're a nuisance, so they're controlled. Predators, they're a nuisance, so they're controlled. Insects, same thing. Bacteria, fungi, if you can't see it and it's not causing a problem, people generally leave it alone. But all those things that control vertebrates, predators, insects, and other things that are pathogens for plants are going to harm. And I don't think it's maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's not hard to imagine that any biocidal thing is going to harm unintentionally non-target organisms in the microbial world, right? Or the macroinvertebrate world. So we're looking at the closedness versus the openness of the system. So natural ecosystem, the energy cycle is fairly closed, right? Growth cycles are completed within the physical boundaries. There's not a lot of removal. Wild plants capture less sunlight energy. Maybe that's not true. Nutrients are cycled within the system, and no diesel fuel is necessary, right? And they're stable. They're at a sort of stable flux, and they're not in equilibrium, right? But they're in a stable flux. If one part of the system fails, another can take over. The agroecosystem, on the other hand, is open. There's tons of inputs, tons of outputs. Seed is imported to the system, yield is exported, crops are bred to harvest more sunlight for more yield. When I look over here on the left-hand side and I say wild plants capture less sunlight energy, I want to say that may not be exactly true, because there's a statement I'll show you later that will talk about this. So I want to forecast that a little bit. More energy is brought into and out of the system. That energy is fuel, it's labor, it's everything you can think of that goes into a farm, and it requires constant management in order to avoid collapse. So I hope y'all are following me here. So a sustainably managed system, an agroecosystem, are those where the function and performance are brought closer to that of the natural ecosystem and further away from a very degrading monocultural dominated system, right? So it requires us to think about moving from a narrow focus on intensification of production at any cost to an awareness of the multiverse of interdependencies between the crops, right? Soil organisms, pests, their enemies, the environment, management, impacts on adjacent ecosystems. The challenge for us, and again, I feel like this organization is like preaching to the choir, the challenge is to strike a balance that allows the producer to earn a fair living in exchange for providing food, fiber, energy crops that enable the whole society to thrive. Now, substitute the native plant garden or restoration manager, the land manager, to achieve their goals in exchange for developing an ecosystem that features native plants and allows everyone to thrive. The microorganisms, the animals, the macroinvertebrates, the people who come visit and enjoy it, right? So there's a lot in there. Oh, that's not, boom. So for me as a soil scientist, I focus below the ground a lot. There's a great book called The Hidden Half, which focuses on plant roots, which are approximately half of the biomass of the plant, approximately half of all photosynthetic energy produced from sunlight and respiration goes down below the soil. There's a lot going on down there. There's an entire ecosystem and food web that exists below our feet that is rich and amazing, right? And so the soil provides an ecosystem. I mean, it is an ecosystem all on its own. It's a massive biome. There's estimated that there are 1 ton of bacterial cells in the top 6 inches of every acre of soil, right? That's quite a bit of bacterial cells. And so soil is a massive resource. Vandana Shiva, who's an advocate for natural resources and less use of fossil fuels, she says in one of her books, Soil Not Oil, that soil, air, and water are commons for every person on earth. They are something we all have a right to access to, right? Because they provide ecosystem services for all of us. If they collapse, we all die. No one's going to survive a total ecosystem collapse of the soil. So we're looking at mycorrhizae, we're looking at the inert clay, sand, and silt particles, we're looking at mites, roots, flagellates, bacteria, ciliates, fungal hyphae, nematodes, water, organic matter. All of that stuff is in the soil, and it makes a rich milieu, excuse my French, of things going on that we are still not completely clued into. Scientists estimate that we've only discovered 5% at most of the microorganisms that live in the soil, right? So it is the most massive microbiome of any of the commons on Earth, right? So, what are the type of ecosystem services that the soil provides? Well, there are four that we generally talk about. There's provisioning. So, in other words, the soil provides food, water, timber, gas, oil, and fiber. We get a lot of these things from the soil. It regulates water flow and filtration. It controls flooding or not, depending on how it's doing its job. It regulates the decomposition of many waste products. The pollination of flowers is regulated by soil. It's cultural, right? So the development of societies and cultures depends on whether you have fertile soil or not, right? And so the cradle of civilization is often taught to us in elementary school was at the Tigris and Euphrates rivers where their confluence was, and they dumped all this silt and organic matter there. And it was great for growing crops until they depleted the soil and the society collapsed. And that's a common recurring theme throughout thousands of years of history that once the soil is degraded and crops can't grow, that society either has to move or die out, right? There's also the aesthetic value. Raise your hand if you love to just look at your native plants, right? Or you feel inspired. That's a real thing. It really connects with us people, and it connects with a lot of animals too. And then there are supporting ecosystems services. So, in other words, the natural processes of nutrient water cycling are supported by the function of the soil. So, we got this graphic over here on the left that shows all the main ecosystem services with soil at the center. And so, I will send these slides to your NIPSOT chapter leader, and we will you can look at this in detail later and have fun with this or share it with anybody else. I'm a state employee, so this is not anything secret. It's your tax dollars at work. Here's a couple of links. Also, when I give you this, you can read a couple of my publications for extension, just about the basics of soils. Know your Texas soils, know how they work, see how they differ across the state. And also, there's one very specifically about the ecosystem services in detail that soil provides. Well, what is soil? Well, I came up with a definition because there's no unified definition amongst people in my discipline. So, soil is an unconsolidated, naturally occurring material of mineral and organic composition at the surface of the earth that supports plant life. And so, if I unpack that a little bit, loose means it's not concreted together. It may be accreted, but we can break it apart fairly easily, right? It may be aggregated into peds or clods, but you can break that down into the individual particles, usually with no more strength than your hand has, right? Sometimes a hammer is needed, but if you break it and it fractures along a plane, that's usually a rock, right? Big flecks shatter off. That's not soil anymore. Natural means it formed on the landscape naturally. Now, here's where philosophy comes in, because y'all know PhD doesn't just mean piled higher and deeper. It also means I'm a doctor of philosophy. So I'm empowered by the University of Georgia to just philosophize wherever I am about anything, frankly. So what is natural? We're natural. We disturb the soil quite a bit. And I still think that's natural soil. We're moving earth around to build our homes, and we bring in new topsoil or something. We still got a natural material. where I think I draw the line somewhere on this side of taking some compost, some soil, some bulking agent, some zeolite, mixing it in a predetermined ratio in a bag and selling it for way too much money at the garden store, calling it potting soil. It's not, it's a soilless media or non-soil media, gross material, right? Mineral and organic matter. Now, this is really important. A lot of people don't understand that soil isn't just the mineral part, where the rocks, the bedrock broke down to smaller and smaller pieces until it was sand, silt, and clay. It is also the organic material. Some people may feel like the organic material is something that's added to the soil, but here in my profession, we consider the organic material to be part of the soil. And there's some discussion amongst some of my colleagues. Some people feel that living bacteria are the soil. I feel that anything that's still alive is a citizen of the soil, and the soil is its habitat. And anything that has died or been excreted by something that living in it is on some part of the spectrum of decay. That's organic matter. Okay. That's just me and a lot of other people. Some people feel a different way. And supports plant life. Okay. So it's not soil until a plant's growing in it. I don't know. It appears in so many definitions in the textbooks that I just decided to keep it. But you can philosophize on your own because it doesn't seem fair. If you got a sand dune over here that's got nothing growing on it, a sand dune over here that's got bunch grass on the top, the bunch grass sand dune is soil, and the other one over here has no value. That doesn't seem fair. So otherwise, they're identical. So seems like an arbitrary thing, but we're working things out in my discipline. Don't worry about it. We'll get there someday. Now, in addition to that definition of soil, we also need to understand that soil has more than just mineral and organic matter. Those are the solids. Those are just the solids. Soil is also all the spaces in between the solids, right? Those spaces are not filled with vacuum. They are filled with air and water. Depending on what those little bacteria and fungi are up to, the air and the gases in the spaces between the solids of the soil may be quite different from the atmosphere right above the soil, right? Now, there is some give and take between the atmosphere and the soil. It takes a little time. It's not instantaneous. So it's important to know that soil isn't just the solids. It is the spaces in between and what's held in those spaces. So I often think about this like that optical illusion art, where you look at it and the first thing you see is a vase, face, vase. And then if you stare at it long enough, you see two faces facing each other. Or maybe you see the faces first and then the vase second, right? But I challenge everybody when you think about the soil, and you're obviously being supported by the solids. That's the obvious thing. It's the first thing you see. But think about the soil as also the spaces in between, just like that optical illusion. And the reason that I bring that up is because the most interesting stuff that happens in soil does not happen inside the solids. It happens on their surfaces, the surfaces that are exposed to the water and the air. Those are interfaces where all the interesting chemistry happens, all the release of nutrients, all the absorption of organic matter. All the roots live in those spaces too. So as a chemist, I'm more interested in, well, whatever it is, the faces of the vase, whatever you saw second, I'm more interested in the spaces because that's where all the action happens. So think about that the next time you're holding some soil in your hand. It's a simple graphic here. We're thinking about biodiversity, then we have really tight, dense soils. They're very compact. They have a high bulk density. We're going to have low soil porosity and we're going to have low opportunities for biodiversity. Now, as we move rightward across this graph, and this is a generalization, don't go like quoting this or drawing this line. You're not going to have 16 species with this much porosity. And of course, you can't have 100% porosity because otherwise that'd be the air, right? So as you go further to the right, you're going to have more species with more space between the soils. So again, this drives home that the space between the solid particles is very, very important. And then also we have this aggregation happening on it. So soil organic matter performs some very important um, functions in the soil that lead to a soil that provides ecosystem function for us. So these are electron micrograph pictures that I took over here on campus. And we've got a sand at the top, and we've got a clay loam at the bottom. You can see the sand at the top is fairly smooth, much like a boulder that's been weathered, out in the desert or something. And then at the bottom, we see all these like cornflakes stuck to a similar type of sand particle. Now, those cornflakes are the extra silt and clay you see in here, 43% silt, 27% clay. At the top, you see 1% silt and 0% clay, right? So you don't have the opportunity for little things to become accreted or stuck to the outside. And what sticks them to the surface is organic matter. And specifically, the easy things that get going are sugars released from plant roots and bacteria. So native species release a lot more, they exude a lot more than crop species do, okay? Now, invasive species may as well, because they're just trying to get a foothold in the system and outcompete. And one of the ways you can outcompete is to get nutrients faster and grow faster, right? So they can exude a lot of things that will bring benefits to them and attracting bacteria to come closer and perform other services for them. But if you've ever spilt lemonade on the counter and waited till it dried, it's sticky, right? So we've got citric acid, we've got sugar, and we've got all the other organic things that come with lemon juice, right? It's very sticky stuff. If you've ever made a protein shake, you left it on, you spilled some on the counter, it's sticky too, right? So proteins, enzymes, amino acids, sugars, all of those things are sticky. And that's what leads to these, what are you doing? That's what leads to all these cornflake type things stuck to the outside here. They're glued by organic matter. Now, if you think about it, there's much more porosity in here that can hold water like a sponge than up here. And so, sands don't hold a lot of water and clay loams do, right? And so that's what's happening. That is a function. Accepting water, holding on to it longer, that is an important ecosystem function. And soil organic matter, I mean, it can be anything, again, that's on the spectrum of decay and not currently alive and organizing energy, right? So fresh plant matter, freshly deceased microorganisms, insects, and animals, fresh products and wastes from living organisms, manure, sugars, enzymes, decomposing organic material, any of the above, somewhere along the decay spectrum. And then there's a couple of really interesting, very stable organic materials that I want to highlight. And you may use them in your establishment of natives and the production of natives, especially if you're trying to be strictly organic, you can use these types of things here. So talking about humus and charcoal, humus, excuse me, humus is the thing I eat. Organic matter serves several important functions in the soil. So we're increasing nutrient storage through cycling, the breakdown and the recreation through biomass, bacterial biomass, increasing water holding capacities. So organic matter is said to hold about 5 times as much water as clay soils can on their own, right? So that's a pretty powerful thing. It improves soil structure through the aggregation of clay particles, which is what we saw on this thing. These are aggregating particles together, right? So we got a lot of stuff, not just that, but habitat for microorganisms. And because it sticks soil together and it's a little bit more sticky, it reduces erosion potential. So humus is a very special example of soil organic matter. So it's stable, like can last 2 months to 2 years. And humus develops naturally over time in undisturbed soils. Okay, if you just leave the soil alone, it will build up organic matter as long as plants are growing there. But if you till it, rototill it, whatever, you're exposing it all, breaking it up, oxygenating it, and it's breaking down and blowing off as CO2 back into the atmosphere more quickly. Now, charcoal is organic matter exposed to high heat and limited oxygen. So if you have plenty of oxygen, you're going to combust. All right. But pyrolysis is what happens when oxygen isn't there. So instead of turning into carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, when it mixes with oxygen, the carbon is forced to condense into ring-like structures and very stable carbon forms, because if there's no oxygen, that's the most favorable reaction left. So that's pyrolysis. So a lot of you have probably heard of biochar, which is Bernard Lehman's term from 30 years ago for biological material turned into char. But I'm just going to tell you a little secret here. All charcoal, since man discovered it, or a woman, was made out of biological material. Okay. So charcoal is already termed, biochar is a fancy term. Bernard Lehman came up with it, Cornell. And all of its charcoal, all of it, not all of it, depending on what it's made from, depending on what its chemical properties are, can provide a lot of benefits and stimulation of root growth. And so charcoal or charred organic matter is why the blackland soils are the color they are. So if you're up in Dallas, you've seen a blackland soil, right? They run from San Antonio all the way up to commerce areas. So you got them up there, right? Texarkana, maybe just a little finger going up there. Those black soils, they crack and when they're dry and they get real sticky when they're wet. That is from thousands and thousands of years, eons maybe, of prairie grass growing on there, and then prairie fires coming across, consuming the oxygen in that zone right there at the top of the soil and creating char, and then buffalo running across them and stamping that charcoal into the ground. And that happens over thousands of years. Your soil turns black. So I hope that is a neat little factoid for you today. Now, there's a British documentarian. He's Sir, he was knighted. It's Attenborough, right? He did it was a really great documentary called The Ocean. And in it, he stated in his very British accent, which I won't attempt to do, that the ocean was the world's largest biome. And I take issue with this because pound for pound, at least when we're talking about microorganisms, there's at least 1 gram or 1 billion microorganisms per gram of soil. That's a low ball. People have said there are 10 to 100 billion microorganisms per gram. But let's say 1 to 10, and 1 billion is the low ball. Now, I'm highballing it for ocean water. At most 1 million microorganisms per gram of ocean water. Okay, the ocean's a lot deeper. Okay, but as you go deeper in the ocean, the number of microorganisms drops off. Okay, same thing with soil. Now, the ocean covers 2/3 of the planet. Soil then covers 1/3 roughly, right? So now 1 billion low ball and 1 million high ball. 1 billion is 1,000 times 1 million. The ocean only has 2 times as much surface of the earth. Nowhere near 1,000 times more, right? So I hope you understand that the soil really is this massive habitat for life that we just haven't even discovered more than the tiniest fraction of yet. I mean, we've got bacteria that they're symbiotes with roots, blue bonnets. They are a legume. So these bacteria are welcomed into the roots. They form these nodules and they feed nitrogen to the bluebonnets. Mesquite trees, another native, do the same thing. They're also legumes. There are all kinds of bacillus in the soil. They provide a lot of benefits to roots by releasing enzymes, releasing nutrients that roots can then take up. They stitch things together. So if you're looking at this picture right here, that's like a fungal hyphae and a particle of soil and a lot of cells of bacteria right there. Maybe it's a root hair or something like that. So there may be a ton of more bacterial living mass per acre of soil. And there's all sorts of niches that they fill, right? So they're doing all the things we do above the ground too. And then there's fungi. So these are some of the things that I do in my lab. We stain roots and we clear them like windows and we stain them with a pelican blue ink is what I buy. And then we clear them with a little vinegar. And then the fungal structures are left for us to see inside the root. So here's hyphae. They're like the roots of fungal organisms. These are vesicles, which they're kidney bean shaped. And so they're like a storage organelle. And then there's some arbuscules here and here where the exchange with the plant happens. So these fungi, particularly these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, can explore 100 times or touch 100 times more soil than a root can alone. If the root gives a small amount of its photosynthate to these obligate symbiote fungi, and in return, the fungi bring a lot of phosphorus, micronutrients, and water back to the plant, both organisms win. Okay, and this is a really important thing that goes on in well-functioning soils. So if we don't have this going on, we have to feed the plant more because it's not able to use its own energy to extract from the soil what may be present, but it can't get at, right? So it's very important interactions going on. So how do native plants contribute to soil ecosystem function? This is sort of the crux of what I've been building to with the inverse pyramid, right? So very broad, we're getting more and more detailed and granular as we go forward. So this is going to answer the question for us here. And in that book, well, there's a couple of agroecology books that, I used to develop this course along with a lot of standalone papers. But one of the things that stood out to me here that I forecasted earlier is that there was a quote in Introduction to Agroecology. Domesticated plants are far more efficient than their wild predecessors in capturing energy from the sun and storing it in a usable packet for the humans that culture them. That's a great quote, right? Because they are more efficient at photosynthesizing for the purpose of producing something we want. But they're producing fewer roots in exchange for more grain or more cotton, right? More soybeans. Native plants are investing tremendous amounts of energy in their roots because they're there for the long haul. They're there for future generations. They're usually perennials, not always, but if they're an annual, their main goal is to make sure they have a whole nother generation that can continue after them and be successful as well. So their energy is going into that. So the thing I wanted to remind us about here is that when we manage for native plant species, we are still managing the ecosystem. It is not a purely natural system. And this is a native prairie restoration project from about 2020 in Harris County that a Girl Scout started. So look, if we're planting them, if we're laying them out, we're managing, right? I mean, if we're digging holes to put these in, we're managing. So it's not a natural system. It doesn't make it bad in any way. I just want us to remember this is not a pristine system. This is something we're doing purposefully and for the love of natives, for the love of nature, right? So it's all a good thing. How are we improving soils on purpose? Particularly drastically disturbed soils, like in pipelines, surface lignite mines, road construction. So here we've got TxDOT projects. Now they've got a wildflower project, but they're also under a mandate or guidelines to anytime they have to restore the roadsides in a new construction project or a renovation of a road, they're supposed to use natives. That is their guideline or mandate, unless it is too expensive or they cannot find them, right? But they, by and large, target native species for the restoration of their roadsides, right? So pipelines, it's a big deal. Like Douglas King Seed is doing a lot of work with these giant pipelines that are running through our Texas landscape. And then surface mines are being renovated as well. I work a lot with the surface mine scientists, and I mean, we work with people like Native American Seed, Bammert, Douglas King, and Turner Seed, and we put together plans with these mines once they put the dirt back on the top and cover up their mining. How do we get that to go back? Natives are a really effective way to do that. Now, what are some of the things we get from natives, whether it's like a large garden, a restoration project, some specific science that I'm going to go through on these last few slides here. Someone has let the dogs out in the side yard. And there's deer. So water requirements, right? I think we all know if we go native and get away from St. Augustine in our yards, we're going to have less of a water requirement. St. Augustine is famous for the amount of water it uses, so that's an extreme example. But it doesn't matter. If we're using a hyper native that belongs in our environment, in our neighborhood, or we're picking, from nearby, and we're propagating from nearby and putting them in our yard. Like we've got a native patch right out here in my backyard, um, that we're really maintaining, and we're propagating, the yopons and all the grasses, the blue stems. Got some side oats out here, so we're moving them around the yard into bigger and bigger patches and more patches instead of lawn. So here's what we're looking at in this graph right here. Okay, so if you look at that diagonal line, it's herbaceous plants versus herbaceous plants. Now we only have one example where we have, if the ecosystem pairs with a native water use, is more efficient than the invasive, then we get a plus, right? And so we can see if we're just doing pair to pair, natives versus invasive evapotranspiration, we have more efficiency in the natives. If we're comparing herbaceous versus woody, I don't know why they have so many examples of that. In every single case, we have a lot better efficiency, right? But then with woody versus herbaceous, woody natives versus herbaceous, we have a little bit more negative, and with woody versus woody, we have a little bit more negative values. But by and large, most of these comparisons favor evapotranspiration that is more efficient under natives. Looking at soil organic matter, this is carbon stocks built in soil from exotic versus native grasslands. And here natives are in the open circles, exotics are in the closed circles. So here's total organic carbon plus total inorganic carbon. And in every case, at every depth, we see that native species, the roots are building a lot more carbon of both organic and inorganic kinds of carbon. And what I mean by inorganic carbon, I mean basically carbonates, okay? Calcium carbonate is a mineral, it's limestone, and carbonates can be sequestered as inorganic, never living carbon in the soil as well. And so if we're just focused on that, we also see that that form of carbon is greater at every depth as well with native plant species. So there's a couple of ecosystem services going on here, right? In the previous slide, we've got better water use efficiency. In this slide, we've got deposition of more organic matter, which is going to lead to aggregation of soils and better water capture and water holding, better rooting for the next generation of plants as well. And so anytime I see something like this sort of flat line here down low, I'm thinking that, these exotic species probably aren't rooting below 40 centimeters that much, but we are seeing a tremendous amount of rooting evidence all the way down to 100 centimeters with it. So we're seeing more depth of rooting, more roots invested in the soil as well, which has its own benefits. I love the idea of biodiversity because, this thing floored me 10 or 15 years ago. I heard that we as human beings are a walking biome that contains more bacterial cells that are not human than our own human cells, right? So the number of cells we're carrying around that are not actually us are greater than the ones that are, right? And our gut functions in a certain way, and our skin functions in a certain way. And you can fingerprint biomes for individuals the way that you use fingerprints, right? Because of the invisible things living on us, right? There's a bacteria on you right now. So biodiversity is very important for our function. You can only imagine how important it is for something larger than us, like a soil ecosystem or everything above ground. And so here in this Cornell Lab of Ornithology report, they looked at bird community metrics on the landscape associated with native plants versus conventional plants. And we're seeing in these three important metrics, which are the number of individuals, the number of different species, and biomass per point, we're winning in natives every single time over conventional plants. And this is really, really important because, birds aren't the only above ground organism, right? When we have natives that belong there, there are certain insects that also belong there. And there are certain birds whose feeding can only happen with certain insects. And if those natives are gone, those insects are gone, those birds are gone, there is a cascade of collapse that happens without biodiversity. Natives can be a real part of that solution. Looking below the ground at fungi again, I do a lot of research into fungi. We see that natives are above invasive plants and ancestral fungi, which are things that live there in the soil already. Edaphic fungi, which means soil loving, they live freely in the soil, and rhizophilic, which are the fungi that associate directly with roots. And we can see here we've got a significant relationship between natives and invasives, but all the way across, we see at least numerical differences here. So in this graph over here on this figure, the light blue is native garden and the purple is turf grass, right? So here we see a significant difference in microbial diversity with native gardens versus turf grass by two different indices of richness or diversity, the Simpson index and the Shannon index. You can look those up later. When we're looking at the distance to the turf grass, the closer we are to the turf grass for the native species, the lower the diversity. The further away we get from it, the higher the diversity. Pretty convincing there. Now with turf quality, the higher the diversity, the higher the quality. I don't know if this is going up or down, but here's what's really striking to me when I looked at this. When we have natives, we have diversity across a wide range of soil pHs. It's almost unchanged. These are almost flatline. So no matter what the pH change of the soil, we've got natives, we've got the same level of diversity, and it's fairly high. But with turf grass, we have this sort of parabolic curve where it's highest at a very specific pH, and then the diversity drops off on either side. So grass, a monoculture, isn't very effective at maintaining diversity when there's changes in the chemical properties of soil. That's a very important thing to remember here too. What do natives provide for us in terms of ecosystem services? Stability against changes in the soil. So again, if you go back to that natural systems, if one part of it fails, another part can step in. That's what biodiversity does for us. All right, so there are just benefits in aesthetic and wellness. I don't really think I need any scientific charts for this. I just want everybody to close your eyes for 10, 15 seconds and think about how nice you feel when you're around native plants, how well you feel compared to being in your office chair or being in someone's perfectly mowed front lawn. Hopefully that was a convincing mental break. That's the end of my presentation here. I hope I've introduced you to some new concepts. Again, I'll email this whole presentation as a PDF to the chapter leader, and y'all can look at it at your leisure later. And now we have time for the questions. Oh, I put everybody to sleep with my bedtime voice. Oh, I think my mute was on the whole time.
No, you weren't so lucky. We heard you the whole time. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, then I won't go and have some chocolate. I'll stay for questions. You can put them in the chat if it's too noisy for everybody to talk at once. So, or maybe I just explained everything perfectly.
Do you want to read the chat or you may read the chat to you?
I've got the chat open on one screen.
Okay. We'll take the one from Scarlett. I know we have one in our meeting area, but we'll let you go first. Oh, I guess the people here in the office or the meeting place do need to hear it, so I'm gonna ask it. How important is it for me to test the soil in my yard as opposed to knowing that I'm in Blackland Prairie generally?
So I think for natives, the soil test isn't really useful because we don't want to fertilize natives, or if we do fertilize them, we want to use very little. Because if we use any kind of substantive fertilizer, we're going to stimulate competition from invasives or other plants that we don't really want, right? So what I've found is adding 5 or 10 pounds of phosphorus as P2O5 at a per acre rate, or half a pound per 1,000 square feet, can be useful in stimulating early root growth and getting establishment of natives out there so that they can outcompete other species early. But I mean, nitrogen isn't something we should be putting out for sure, because you're just going to make the weeds go crazy. And by weeds, I mean the plants we really don't want, not native. So I don't know the
What
usefulness of the
about
soil.
toxins in the soil?
Okay, so if you're in a brownfield or infill in the city, you definitely want to find out about that. And a typical soil test isn't going to give you that. You would want to know if your pH is way out of whack, because sometimes limestone can be very effective at getting the soil back to where um, natives can be established. So I'll amend what I said. Knowing what the pH is, if it's really low, like 4.5, you want to put some limestone out. Other things you could see, like slaking, or the soil seems to be sort of smeared across the top and you're not getting very good infiltration. It can be from salty water irrigation, or just poor management over the years, and a little bit of gypsum can help start that aggregation to kickstart it again. And gypsum is a naturally occurring mineral. Calcium sulfate. Limestone is calcium carbonate. So the most I would recommend really is adjusting pH if you're very low, like under 5.2 or 5.
In restoring natives, oh, I skipped one,
Oh,
sorry.
wait, well, hold on. Wait, and then I'm going to get to the
Oh,
toxicities.
okay.
So our soil lab doesn't do heavy metals, which is going to be a problem in a lot of urban brownfields, right? So you can send those to certain laboratories like Aquatech, Eurofins, or I can't remember the other names. But there are many labs, you can find them online. And then if you're like at an old dry cleaners or something, you're going to want to look for organics and those kind of things that can get very, very expensive. I mean, if you have your heart set on restoring some land, um, with natives, right, you may want to go with something you don't eat first, then finding out what was on that land and what are the likely contaminants. Garages have a lot of lead, and a lot of total petroleum hydrocarbons. Dry cleaners have all those nasty chemicals that can be carcinogens laying around too, and those can be very expensive. But if you want to fix that up, you'll spend some money, a few $100s on testing, know what you're dealing with. Um, I, what you're going to do to fix the problem is probably going to be plants rather than excavation. So.
Can you recommend sources or plans for successful transition to natives?
Yeah, um, you may need to control everything and do a reset. Um, you certainly want to try and make sure that you don't have compaction. So look for specific issues, salinity, compaction, a lot of invasives that are woody and hard to control. Then you may need to go in and do something drastic, like just do a reset. Bush hog everything, till it, control it, and then come back in with native. So that may take, if you're unwilling to use any kind of herbicide, and I'm not recommending you do, then cold hard steel or multiple cultivations are probably going to need to be done, which is going to really set the soil back as well. But if you can get established and start to outcompete early with the invasives, that's the way to do it. So it depends on how extreme the situation is. And, each one can be a little bit different. Like we were at Fort Hood, where teenagers had been driving Bradley attack vehicles over this soil for decades. And they wanted to reestablish natives on it. But I mean, I couldn't even get a shovel in this soil. Um, and so we tilled some, we didn't till some, we planted different mixes. And then it was 22, 23. So we had these terrible droughts, right? And then they weren't supposed to be using this part, but they shot up our patch with heavy shelling, destroyed our weather station and everything else. And then it came out there, and the patch was set on fire with craters in it. And I don't know what we learned from that. So, but I've seen some extreme situations, and I think they can all be overcome. It's just, are you willing to do a trade-off and really do a reset in order to get what you want or not? Otherwise, you can spend a number of years just trying to get there slowly.
In restoring native prairies, it often involves removing aggressive native trees, i.e., honey locust, mesquite. What does this do to the soil quality?
Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, mesquite's a native, and I don't know if the range extends to Dallas, but the native range, but it certainly does in my neck of the woods. So, um, it taking out trees and replacing them with grasses or shorter plants, there aren't going to be a lot of trees, right? Unless it's just wall to wall trees, you're not going to see a lot of damage to the soil. Replace it with something that's a little more biodiverse. But those trees do have their niche within the biodiversity. So is it going to harm soil function? Probably not, but you may consider leaving some in to have that biodiversity, because the shade that's there attracts different kinds of macroinvertebrates, bugs, and insects. Those things are going to attract other slightly larger predators or burrowers, right? And so I put it this way because I had a talk one time after a man who was talking about developing biodiversity on his land and his property, and they had a duck haven that they created, and they excavated a pond and built a berm, and then they put in these willow type grasses. I forget what's native here, and attracted ducks and everything else. But he wanted his kids to be able to go down to the edge, so they mowed it all the way around, so that there wouldn't be snakes or anything like that. And as soon as when he was done talking, I did say to him that I think what he did wasn't create biodiversity. He created a duck pond, and he excluded a lot of things that naturally would want to come to that thing. So I think about that. Like, what is the right thing to do when you want to remove things that maybe you don't want or they're not your target? Think carefully about that and think about what your goals are and what those um, benefits those things might actually have. Maybe thin them out rather than remove them altogether, or make your own choices. So,
I'm gonna skip one question because it's a follow-up to that one.
okay.
Do you know, have you had experience with removing Bermuda without damaging the soil health too much?
Oh,
Minds want to know.
yeah. So Bermuda is always in my vegetable garden the most pernicious weed, most insidious, foe I have. So, but when I look at it, I mean, it's a bred grass. It's bred in Georgia, right? So it was an African star grass and another. grass mixed together there. And it is not a native species, but it produces stolons and rhizomes that can do a lot with soil, and it grows very, very fast, and it tolerates a lot of different conditions. So I don't know that Bermuda is bad for soil, right? But it probably doesn't promote as much above ground biodiversity as we would like to see. So
But
for
I
the
guess the
soil,
question
I think it's
is how
okay.
to remove it without damaging the soil, or you just dig to China and try to repair it afterwards.
Yeah, so I mean, disturbing the soil isn't necessarily damaging it, right? So there's all kinds of natural ways that the soil gets disturbed: fire, burrowing animals, worms, all kinds of stuff, right? So don't be afraid to disturb the soil at all, right? So pulling something out, buffalo were ripping at grasses and pulling them out by the roots too. So if it's something you want to do, you're not really destroying the soil. You're not turning it over, you're not plowing it in. That tends to be a little bit more traumatic than just pulling up some roots. Good luck with that, because I mean, removing it all together, it's insidious. I mean, there's underground roots. If you don't get them all, they create a whole nother plant right there. So
Yeah, never till it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So
Our last question from the chat is, how do you suggest beginning to replant bare eroded soil?
well, you may need something to cover it to keep it from eroding more. I mean, if it's bare and eroded, it may be a great time to just do a little bit of rototillering and incorporate some kind of organic matter, like I mentioned earlier. There's composts, there's manures, there's biochar, right? So you can use that opportunity to incorporate a little bit more um, organic matter, get yourself started. Get your seeds in there, cover it nice and thick, rough it up, because I've found that natives just on the surface don't really want to establish as quickly, and they're already persnickety, right? So they may sit there for a couple of years before that seed decides to come up, or some of them may come up this year. But you put them a little bit under the ground, rough it up, scarify some of those seeds in the with a rake or something like that. You'll have a little bit better of an initial stand. Baby it for a little while, make sure they get up, make sure you're seeing those things come up. You're going to have some of that old seed bank come up too. And then once you're able to identify certain natives coming up, make sure they can get up above the soil a little bit. And then, once they're teenagery, you should be able to relax your maintenance a little bit more. But you really have to, I think, pay attention to them on a degraded piece of land or piece of soil in order to really get good results in the first 2 years. And I'm recommending incorporation of organic matter and some watering.
Okay, well, we're going to attempt to take one question from here. Peter, do you think you can talk loud enough? Let me know if you can't hear him.
Is it true that soils in forests are dominated by fungi, while soils in grasslands are dominated by bacteria?
I don't think that's necessarily true across the board. Um, so you're going to have in grasses, you're going to have a lot of endophytic fungi, a lot. I mean, we have seen a lot, particularly in large perennial stands. And endophytic fungi are the ones that live symbiotically inside the roots. Like a portion of their anatomy is inside and a portion of their anatomy is outside. Woody roots, on the other hand, in forests are going to have ectophytic. So they're only going to attach to the outside of the root and interface there. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fungi in both systems. I think because you have a lot more fine hairs, and everything's a lot more dense along the surface, you're going to have a lot more bacteria than you in a grassland than you would in a forest. But I think the ratios are going to change depending on, you know, the part of the world you're in, the type of the soil, all that kind of thing. So, you know, if you're in the piney woods around Overton, a lot of sandy soils, I'm not going to expect as much bacteria or fungi as I would in an old growth deciduous forest. So, it really does change from specific ecosystem to ecosystem, but I would not discount the amount of fungi in a perennial grass system at all. They're going to be rife in there. So different types, though, different types of functional fungi are going to exist in each grassland and forest. But the thing that, you know, I don't know if you probably heard about this researcher in Canada that got started with these like 500-meter long, half kilometer, you know, 1 mile, say quarter mile long single strands of fungi talking between two trees and sharing resources. You know, there's this whole superorganism idea that's out there about the fungi that interact with certain old growth forest trees and share resources like sugars, carbohydrates, and some kind of signaling mechanism for stress for trees that can be, again, like a quarter mile apart. So it's pretty amazing stuff out there that we really just don't understand totally. But yeah.
So Nancy?
Can you explain a little bit about how nitrogen fixers make nitrogen available to plants? Is that?
Sure. Our atmosphere is 78.5% nitrogen. It's nitrogen gas, so it's N2, and it's very stable. So when nitrogen becomes N2 gas, it rises up into the atmosphere, and it's so stable that it sort of accumulates there. So it's the dominant gas in our atmosphere. Almost 80% of our atmosphere is nitrogen gas. That's not usable by plants. It's unfortunate. There's a lot of it. In order to break that bond and turn it into the usable form, which is either nitrate or ammonium, you need a lot of energy, high temperature, and a catalyst to lower the energy required to jump that reaction, to jumpstart that reaction, right? So we do that in factories, which is called the Haber-Bosch process. We use iron filings as a catalyst. We use high temperature and high pressure, a lot of energy. We burn fossil fuels to get that done, and we make ammonium fertilizer out of it. And all the other fertilizers that we have are basically from that initial process. So we get urea by recombining the waste carbon dioxide from the gases, and nitrate can be made by oxidizing that a little further. Lightning can fix the nitrogen in the atmosphere into plant usable forms. But because it's such a hard bond to break, the reason is it takes a lot, you got to put a lot of energy into it. So there's not a lot of opportunities in nature to do that, except for these certain bacteria create an enzyme that is its own type of catalyst that lowers that energy. What in thermodynamics is called a potential well, and it decreases the difference between this side of the reaction and that side of the reaction, so that a smaller amount of energy is needed to make that change. That's what a catalyst does. It reduces the amount of energy required to make that change. The bacteria does that, takes atmospheric nitrogen, turns it into ammonia, feeds it to the plant, and then in return the plant gives photosynthate energy and sugars over to the bacteria, which couldn't live without a plant host at all. And so what happens is if there's any substantive nitrogen in the soil already, the plant will not allow that bacteria to set up in its roots. But if it is hurting for nitrogen or stressed for nitrogen, it will soften its root walls and allow the bacteria in to set up these nodule spherical formations. So I hope that answers your question. This is a little thermodynamics for you today.
Now we all need a PhD.
Piled higher and deeper.
Do we
Okay.
have any other questions in house? Nope. And I think our chat is empty. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, I'm going to
Awesome.
email you the PDF as soon as we're done here, but thank you for your time and attention. And I think it's a great organization. So I'm glad you all are part of it.
All right, we hope to see you in Salado.
We'll see. I like Salado. All right. Thanks, y'all. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.